All right, everybody, we're back. We bring on a special guest. This is a reoccurring guest, feels like a yearly occurrence. None other than Howard Beck, senior NBA writer for The Ringer. Howard, how are you?
Doing great, guys. I think first time joining you as senior writer for The Ringer, as opposed to just whatever floating in space or wherever I was the last time we chatted. But good to see you again. Good to be back,
Oh, awesome.
and good
Always
to be at The
welcome.
Ringer, and good to be introduced as of The Ringer. So
Hey, that it is, and yeah, no, it's funny because we've kept in touch over the last few years, and maybe a few different roles, but you are doing great work at The Ringer. Howard, I think it was a couple months ago. Was it maybe in May you published an article about the Pacers during their playoff run? Is that May?
yeah, that's probably right because I was covering the New York side of the Knicks Pacers series. So whenever they were at the Garden, I was there writing live off of those. So yeah, got to see your Pacers in all their glory. It was rather intense at the Garden, as you may have heard,
Mhm.
and quite a series. That was actually a lot of fun.
It really was. I attended game one. Unfortunate loss for Indiana. Wanted to go to game seven. Felt like I was a jinx. Sat that one out, and the Pacers got they got done. So I can't complain too much. But talk to me a little bit about what you saw from this Pacers Eastern Conference run. Always love to get someone's opinion who's not so involved in Pacer Nation to say.
I mean, I gotta say, like, there's some caveats we could put on this, right? I'm gonna do the caveats first, just to get it out of the way, so people don't think I'm trying to dwell on the I'll call them caveats, not asterisks. Um, 47 win season, I think, exceeded expectations. Going to the Eastern Conference Finals absolutely exceeded expectations. The caveats come in where, okay, you smoke a Bucks team that has no Giannis Antetokounmpo, and then you beat the Knicks in seven when the Knicks are completely beat up and losing guys along the way. It all still matters. It's all legit. All of NBA history looks like this on some level, right? Nobody is ever 100% healthy, and nobody ever wins series or even championships without a little bit of good luck along the way. Good health for your team and some bad luck for the opposite team. Like that's just the NBA. So I'm not downgrading it at all, but I do think that the context matters when I say they far exceeded expectations. There's some context to that some things broke their way. That said, they made a lot of their own fate, right? They made their own good fortune. Um, despite losing Mathurin along the way, despite Halliburton being beat up for the last, the second half of the season, and not quite being as impactful as he had been in the early part of the season. It was, I think, the first time since the trade that landed Halliburton there that we thought, okay, I was always pretty high on him, even going back to when he was with the Kings. But it was a moment where you said, he's not just talented. He's not just a big point guard with an interesting skill set and a funky shot that somehow works and everything. No, like he's actually a guy who's got a certain swagger and a confidence to him, and that can lead. It's one thing to have a point guard who can be your leading scorer, your leading playmaker. All that's great, fine. I've seen plenty of guys who had the numbers and the skill set, but didn't necessarily have that galvanizing impact. And I feel like Halliburton does. He's the first person we're thinking about with that team now, and not by default because of stats, but by presence. And I think that was evident throughout the season. I think that was especially evident in that playoff run. And I think, again, as they're making their own fate, taking the swing for Pascal Siakam at a time when the league wasn't sure, like, is he going to resign with this team or that team? At certain points, was Toronto asking too much? Are the Raptors trying to hold on to him because they want to resign him themselves? Like, there was some risk in making that swing for Siakam. So again, they made a lot of their own fate, and I think other guys just kind of emerging along the way, like Nemhard. Uh, it was just a really fun and often unexpected kind of breakout season. And, those are kind of my favorite storylines in any given season, right? Like, it was the Kings the year before. And actually there's some parallels there too we can get to. But I was really impressed. I was really impressed. And I think too, like, Rick Carlisle, old school coach, hard ass, hard ass with us in the media too at times. And I'll be honest, like when he left the Mavericks and, it's like, okay, Rick's had a great career. Is there another chapter? Okay, he goes to Indiana. How's that going to work with younger players? The further the distance gets sometimes between an older coach and younger players, especially somebody who has that really old school style, you're not sure if it's still going to resonate or be productive in the same way. And it has been. He's done a phenomenal job with them.
Yeah, I mean, Rick Carlisle, I think, was the right answer for Indiana, especially after they botched the hiring of Nate Bjorkgren from Toronto. So it was just they tried to erase that from their memory.
And I already forgot about the Nate Bjorkgren era.
That's the goal here for the Pacers front office. But moving forward though, realistic expectations for this team, because I do think that a lot of people are kind of overlooking them once again, saying last year's run was a little bit of a fluke because of all the teams they played at injuries. They got swept by Boston when they got there. So, I mean, what are some realistic expectations for this Pacers team next season?
So this is where my Kings parallel comes in, and not just because they're tied together by the trade, of course. 2 seasons ago, the Sacramento Kings had this breakthrough season. They finished third, I think, in the West, and exceeded all expectations based on, whether it was record or place in the standings. Losing the first round, it's kind of a pseudo upset because they lose to the Warriors, so that there's no shame in that. But I said before last season, and I hope I'm not right again with the Pacers, because I was unfortunately right with the Kings, that the Kings could be just as good or even better than they were in their breakthrough season and possibly sink in the standings because the West changed so much around them. And it's a little bit different for the Pacers, but there's a little bit of a similar context too, in that, this wasn't a great year for the East last season. And I do think as you're looking at, now as we're coming down, we're mid-August, and maybe there's still some moves that'll be surprising us in the next 6 weeks. But if everybody's rosters end up as they are today, that or at least I would say I'm pretty confident. Boston, Philadelphia, the Knicks, and the Bucks. I think that's the top 4 in the East, probably, right? Those 4. The next 3, like Cleveland, could maybe break the top 4. We'll see, what kind of impact Kenny Atkinson makes there. But Cleveland, I think, is probably the next team up, and then Orlando and Indiana. So there's your top 7 in some order in the East. And then there's, some other teams that are interesting, but I'm not sure what to make of Miami right now. The Hawks are in a state of kind of transition, and, Charlotte, Toronto, Chicago. I don't even know what to make the rest. The East is still kind of a disaster, frankly, but it's stronger at the top than it was last season. And, even the Bucks are going to go in with Doc Rivers from day one instead of going in with Adrian Griffin from day one, realizing it was a mistake and then firing him midway through and hiring Doc along the way. It'll be year 2 with Dame and Giannis together. They've made some decent additions, deeper in the rotation. So I just think that the top of the East is going to be better than it was. And the Pacers, like the Kings last season, could come into this thinking we're good, we're on the rise. We'll have a full season of Siakam. Nembhard will take another step. Mathurin will be healthy. He takes another step. Nesmith maybe takes another step. Halliburton takes another step, and all of that could bode well for maybe a 50-plus win season. But if the Celtics are still as great as they were, and if the Sixers are as great as we think they could be, and if the Knicks don't miss Hartenstein too much and really benefit from the Bridges addition, and if the Bucks stay healthy, how are you breaking through that top tier in the East? So that's a long-winded way of saying I think the Pacers are still top 6 or 7 in the East, but where in that pecking order they are, I think is kind of hard to say. And I do think that it's unlikely that they're a top 4 team just based on the strength of those other teams I mentioned.
It's all fair points. Now, question for you. Do you think the Pacers made the right move running it back, re-signing, bringing this core back that just had a lot of success, went to the Eastern Conference Finals? Or do you think they should have perhaps thought maybe the grass could be a little bit greener and made a move to upgrade this roster?
I don't know what the next move would be necessarily, and you may have ideas, and I'm happy to hear them. I think that once you've made the big swing for Siakam and you've got your co-star to go with Halliburton, and he fit really well, and he seemed to really enjoy it there, and he seemed to really find his stride. Like, you've already made your move, and you guys know the landscape now, like aprons and second aprons and luxury taxes and all this stuff. Like, it's a little harder to maneuver than it was before, and they've got a lot of good young talent, and some of it's still cheaper talent because of its youth and on rookie deals and all that kind of stuff. So, you've already made your big swing. I think you've got to see what a full season of this looks like, and I think you've got to see what it looks like as some of your young guys continue to evolve, right? So I have no problem with them running it back at all, especially when, like, unless your next move was going to be bring back Paul George, for instance, which was something that somebody suggested that to me maybe as late June, early July when I was poking around. Maybe it was even back in February when I was writing about this after the trade deadline. But somebody in the league had suggested to me, like, hey, if Paul George ends up breaking loose, leaves the Clippers, maybe keep an eye on the Pacers. That would be an interesting, and I could make, like, there was a good case to be made for it, actually. That would have been a fun homecoming. But unless you were going to pull off something like that, and who knows what it would have cost them, are you really one move away from catching the Celtics or from leapfrogging, Philly, Milwaukee, New York? Maybe, but I don't think you've got to rush that. And the Pacers historically, I would say, again, correct me if you guys disagree, but, like, I think the Pacers historically have been a fairly conservatively run franchise.
Definitely.
They hit a fork in the road, and more often than not, I think they've nailed the fork, right? Like, they did it with Sabonis Halliburton swap. They did it when they got Sabonis in the first place, with the Paul George trade. So, like, they're not usually making the swing for the fences move. And the Siakam trade was a departure from that. So, and again, once you've got two stars, two All-NBA caliber players, and you're already in business. That's the goal for any team. Get a star if you don't have one. And once you've got one, make sure you get a second one to support the first one. If you could somehow pull off a third, which is rarer and rarer in today's NBA, the Sixers notwithstanding, but, Daryl's going to chase stars every time. But that was a really rare situation where we've got two stars and we were able to clear basically all this cap room. That's hard to do. And so, no, I think the Pacers they've traveled a logical path here.
No, and I think you bring up Paul George, and that was, like, out there in the ether. Maybe it could happen, maybe it wouldn't happen. But I think that is the type of player the Pacers do need to go look to add if they want to add another player to their roster. There seems to be some question marks there at that, small forward spot. Is Aaron Nesmith the long-term starter there, because he is only 6'5", is limited with what he can do offensively. So I do think that is a question. But you bring up Paul George, you bring up what the Sixers did. I mean, all these offseason moves look great right now. But I think the biggest thing that's come down to Philadelphia for the majority of his career there is Joel Embiid and his inability to stay healthy for the entirety of the season. So, I mean, I definitely agree with you that Philly has a chance to be, like, right up there at the top contending if Embiid can, stay healthy. But that seems to be the biggest question mark. And, what can they do to try to help Embiid maybe stay a little bit healthier? And then with the additions they made, what do you think of their roster?
Yeah, so my general rule of thumb in prognosticating, and I don't consider myself some great prognosticator by any stretch, and I hate making predictions, but my general rule of thumb in the offseason is to assume health. Unless somebody's got some chronic condition, unless somebody's coming off of surgery, like Kawhi Leonard is kind of like the exception to my rule. Like, I'm never going to assume a full season of health for Kawhi Leonard. And maybe I should apply that to Joel Embiid. And if you want to make that case, that's fair. But, he does not have a chronic condition. He gets hurt a lot. Kawhi actually has a chronic knee problem. So that's going to keep resurfacing by definition. In Embiid's case, he just gets hurt a lot. There's not any one thing that is causing him to miss 30 games a season. So I'm going to assume health. And if I assume health on Embiid, Paul George, and Maxey, and they did a really nice job of cobbling together a supporting cast around him and stealing Caleb Martin and bringing back Oubre. Like they've got a good, solid group around them. If I assume health, and by the way, when I say assume health, I'm not assuming 82 games of any of these guys. But if they could get 65, 67, 70, whatever from their stars, they're going to be top 4 in the East. And if Embiid misses 20-something games, but Paul George and Maxey are healthy for those games, they can survive that much better having acquired Paul George than having not had Paul George, right? So the real question is Embiid healthy next spring? Because they'll be wherever they are in the standings. If they're healthy next spring with those 3 stars, they're going to be as tough of an out as anybody in the East. And I think the biggest challenger to Boston. Can the Sixers, to your question, Alex, like can the Sixers somehow nurse Embiid through a season and protect him a little bit? It's hard to say. Like, again, he doesn't have a chronic issue where you're saying, oh, we've got to protect this 3 times, operated on knee or something. It's more a matter of more minutes is more wear and tear and more risk of something happening. Sometimes Joel Embiid just got his face broken, like sometimes it's just stuff just happens. And yeah, I mean, it's fair. It's fair to raise the question with Philly. And for anybody who's any of the rival teams in the East or fans of those teams, you're kind of rooting for his history to creep up again.
Speaking of a rival team, a team that the Sixers ran into last year in the playoffs, the New York Knicks. They made a big splash. Mikal Bridges, they re-signed OG. If they had been able to work it out with Hartenstein, I would have thought that they had one of the, if not the best off seasons. They clearly have a true identity on the defensive side of things. That's another team. If you do assume health, you got to factor the Knicks into plans that they could make a solid run this upcoming season. What are your thoughts on what the Knicks did in the offseason and what they could be capable of this upcoming year?
Yeah, it's funny because if they had somehow been able to keep Hartenstein, it's an A+ offseason. Like they gave up, a ton of draft capital, yes, to get Mikal Bridges, but considering his skill set, considering his ability to just check so many boxes, right? He's like this most simplistic thing to say is he's a 3-and-D wing at best, but he's also a guy who can run your offense, and he's a great playmaker. He's a great all-around person and locker room presence. He's got obviously the Villanova connection with all the rest of the Knicks, and so they've got great vibes. They already had great vibes. The vibes are immaculate, as they say. If there's anything beyond immaculate, the Knicks, I think, have it. But they did lose Hartenstein, who was, as you guys saw, like super important, like critical in beating the Sixers in the first round. First round. And then, to the extent that the Knicks were staying in that series against your Pacers, so much of that was Hartenstein keeping possessions alive repeatedly. The offensive rebounds and the putbacks, and then his passing. Besides, he's a big body. He just it's funny how players blossom in this league sometimes. Like how many teams had he been with before the Knicks, and he just became absolutely essential to their success. And it's not just losing him; it's the fact that Mitchell Robinson, who's been their starter off and on for most of the last 4 years, is hurt all the time, and it is not as consistent a player anyway. Like both of them at full health, you're starting Hartenstein every time. So, and they didn't replace him. It was hard to. I'm not blaming them for that. It's they're capped out and aproned out and everything else. So after Mitchell Robinson, they've got one player who's 6'10", and that's Jericho Sims, who I don't think you want to be playing a ton of minutes. Everybody else is 6'8" or shorter. So they're as a team, the Knicks are missing some size and some offensive rebounding and everything else that Hartenstein brought with him. But the offset is that they have gained a ton of versatility in bringing on Bridges, right? I can't remember where we left off here before we had some glitches, but Mikal Bridges, not just a 3-and-D wing, but a guy who can do a lot with the ball in his hands. He can play make. I think that to the extent that they were at times over-reliant on Jalen Brunson last season, I think Bridges actually helps with that, right? It's not like they went out and got some great backup point guard, but I think Bridges maybe a more versatile and skilled version of Andre Iguodala with the Warriors, right? Where Iguodala was essentially their second unit playmaker and lead lead ball handler. I think Bridges can do a lot of that, and I think he helps balance out that lineup a little bit. Can stabilize the second unit if Tibbs ends up using him that way, and they've just got so much versatility across the board between Bridges and DiVincenzo and Hart and just all these wings who have size and shooting and defensive ability and who play hard. The NBA is such a funny league in this way, right? Where you think, oh, well, if I lose X number of rebounds per game and second chance points because we lost Hartenstein and we don't have anybody who does what he does, you might just make up for it in other ways. Like maybe they're just going to be an absolutely devastating small ball team when they're playing small, which will have to be a lot probably because again, if Precious Achiuwa at 6'8" is your backup center and Mitchell Robinson's going to get hurt a lot, and you don't want to necessarily play a ton of Jericho Sims, unless they make a move for another center between now and opening night, they're going to have to be a great small ball team. But I think they've already shown that ability, and Bridges makes them that much more potent.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the move to go out and get Bridges, I do think that it was a lot that they paid to get him. And I think Bridges, as the number one in Brooklyn, was not really ever going to reach that level of player, in my opinion. But being with this Knicks team, I think it's a perfect fit. So I think it's a great move by New York to go out and get him. It makes him that much more versatile, that much better. But another move I thought was really interesting was Cleveland. They fired JB Bickerstaff. They bring in Kenny Atkinson, and we haven't really seen Kenny as a head coach in a couple of years, but I'm curious, what kind of different wrinkles do you think he'll add to that Cavaliers team that maybe Bickerstaff couldn't?
I'm not sure. I know Kenny a bit, from his time here in Brooklyn and from his time with the Knicks when he was an assistant under Mike D'Antoni, and I was covering them back then. I am pretty sure that, I don't want to make too many assumptions here. We'll see what the Cavs look like, when things get started, but knowing what I do about Kenny Atkinson, I gotta think, and also given the number of years he just spent with the Warriors, where ball and player movement was kind of important, I'm gonna guess he's gonna try to lean into a little bit more dynamism and ball and player movement with the Cavs offense. We also saw, over the last 2 years with the Cavs, and certainly last season, quite strikingly, that unfortunately for them, they weren't necessarily at their best when their four best players were on the court together. It was sometimes when it was Donovan Mitchell and Jared Allen together, or Garland and Mobley together. And maybe there's some other, I haven't looked at the numbers of mixing and matching, but maybe there's some other combinations that were effective. But that team, unfortunately, the overlap between their two guards and the overlap between their two bigs, despite all the talent, it hasn't always, been a better than the sum of their parts situation. And so I wonder if part of what Kenny will do is to find, effective ways to stagger those pairings or stagger, any three of the four, break up the guards as much as possible within a game. And again, maybe just kind of reformat the offense to highlight a little bit more movement so that, when Donovan Mitchell doesn't have the ball in his hands, he's not just standing around waiting and watching Garland and vice versa. And that's always the risk. And that's why I was never all that convinced or sold on the move for Mitchell. It's a great trade on some level, but I've never been convinced that a Mitchell Garland backcourt was going to be, effective or successful long-term. And I'm still not convinced. And I'm still curious to see, now that they've re-signed Donovan Mitchell, after all the speculation that he might leave, do they finally move Garland? How far do they go with this? Because they have functional concerns with those four, and they absolutely are going to start having second apron and luxury tax concerns.
It's a great team on paper, but I don't think anyone's 100% convinced that it's going to work and Cleveland's going to go on this run right now, especially when you ran through some of the really impressive teams in the East. Another team that had a good year that really isn't going to get the shine. Look, if the Pacers aren't getting a lot of shine, the Orlando Magic probably aren't going to get that shine that maybe they deserve. But this is a young team that was really good defensively, came out of nowhere, made the playoffs. And now you look, they added KCP, who has proven his worth in the league the last few years. He's been a championship piece to a few different teams. And you look at, Paolo Banchero should take a big step forward, already a really talented player. Franz Wagner, I mean, how good do you think that the Magic could be either this year or in the coming years, knowing how much young talent they have on paper or on this roster for years to come?
I've been a little slow to come around on the Magic over the last couple of years, and they certainly exceeded my expectations last season, and they may well prove me wrong again. But I'm still a little skeptical of them. Like I like the KCP pickup a lot, not just for his 3-and-D abilities, but also he's won championships with 2 teams. He's a veteran on joining a still relatively young team. I like that aspect of it. I'm still not sure about their playmaking, and just about their point guard situation. Is Jalen Suggs? He's a great defender. Is he really the guy you want as your primary playmaker? Maybe. I mean, he's come a long way there. And I don't want to dwell too much on young, versatile, impactful scorer having low efficiency, because we see it a lot and guys get better as time goes on. But there are some efficiency concerns with Paolo Banchero. I ran this one earlier just to double check, but of everybody who averaged 20 points a game last season, so that's 45 players who averaged at least 20 points a game, he was 44th out of the 45 in effective field goal percentage and true shooting percentage. And so that put him in a range with Cade Cunningham, Kyle Kuzma, Cam Thomas. Nice
group.
It's not, not great. I think the good news is, by bringing another scorer and shooter in KCP, and just the natural evolution, I think, too, of a young team and a young player, I think he can get more efficient by not having to force some shots along the way, right? Like maybe there's more open shots for Caldwell Pope or somebody else, and as these guys evolve as a group, and as Paolo Banchero evolves as a young player, I think there's plenty of room to improve on the efficiency numbers. So I don't want to dwell too much on it, but it's there. They were 22nd in offensive efficiency last season. Their success was predicated on their defense, which was elite, and they can replicate that. I think they can be elite defensively again. And if you can move from bottom third in offensive efficiency to even middle of the pack, middle third somewhere in the league, then maybe you're jumping up another spot or two. But, when it comes right down to it, it's the same issue as I laid out for the Pacers. How many of these teams that we were talking about earlier, are they ready to leapfrog? I'm not sure that Banchero, Wagner, KCP, Isaac, Suggs is ready to overtake, a fully healthy, fully functioning Sixers, Bucks, Knicks, or Celtics team.
Yeah, I think Orlando is a really interesting team. I think Jonathan Isaac might have one of the best contracts in the NBA with the way that it's structured and things like that. And I think Jamal Mosley is a really good defensive coach that's ascending. But, they are kind of in a weird spot where I do think there's some limitations. I'm still a little bit in shock that they took Jett Howard in the lottery in the draft 2 years ago. But I want to move on to Milwaukee now, because you brought them up earlier, a full year now under Doc Rivers. I will say I always enjoyed his conversation with Bill Simmons on the Ringer. So a little bit disappointed we won't get those as much, but I do think Doc's a good coach. He's been coaching for a long time. They get Dame, healthy and having a full offseason to train. I know Doc's mentioned that on Bill's podcast, like having the ability to actually go full in training mode, with knowing that the trade could have got halted last year with Portland if he got hurt. Giannis coming back from his injury that he missed the entire playoffs, and then Middleton having, like 2 surgeries, I think, at the end of the season. So just kind of curious your thoughts on this group that Milwaukee has, and maybe some of the smaller moves they made around the edges to try to make this team a little bit better.
Well, the good news on the Doc Rivers podcasting front is that he was on with Bill this week. In fact,
I heard it.
So
good stuff.
I guess he's still free to chat during the off season, but yeah, probably not as many appearances during the season now that he's back to full-time coaching. Yeah, I mean, listen, I know, Doc took a lot of blows last season, because, they ended up finishing a couple games under 500 during his tenure, and some of the stats were better under Adrian Griffin, but they had 3 coaches in a year. I mean, they went from Budenholzer to Griffin to Doc in a span of 7 months or something. And, Dame Lillard's first time in his career that he's not the be all end all of an offense. Trying to mesh with Giannis, a player who, and a player type that he's never had before as a teammate, and certainly the best, the most talented teammate he's ever had. And they had age issues and injury issues and, Chris Middleton health issues and everything. So it was choppy. And unfortunately for the Bucks, ever since their championship, that's just kind of been the way things are. And this is a team where, contrary to my usual rule about assume health, Chris Middleton's so often injured, and it is the knees almost every time, I think. Again, I'd have to look it up, but I'm pretty sure it's always the knees. Then I do have concerns. But if we assume health, there's still a lot of talent there. And I think year 2 of Dame and Giannis together will look better than year 1 did, assuming Dame can keep, Father Time at bay for a little longer here. Doc Rivers gets a full season with them and a training camp with them. That matters a lot. And I think they quietly had a really good offseason. Like, nothing dramatic, nothing that's, setting the world on fire, but they got Gary Trent Jr. I think, what was it, on a minimum?
A minimum deal.
Was,
yeah.
Incredible. The Laker fans and maybe Heat fans and some other teams out there are probably wondering why they couldn't have pulled that off. Speaking of the Lakers, they got Taurean Prince from the Lakers. They signed Dylan Wright, so they've kind of replenished the rotation in a way that they really badly needed to, right? Especially once they made the deal for Dame last year, it really kind of depleted them. So Gary Trent Jr., 39% on threes last season. Prince, despite the fact that Laker fans hated him, also shot around 39% on threes last season. And a decent wing defender. DeLon Wright's a good defender. So they've bolstered themselves a little bit, and everything else is just like, do Giannis, Dame, Lopez, Middleton all stay healthy, right? They do have a lot of miles and a lot of injury issues in the past, but the Bucks should absolutely, again, assuming health, they're a top 4 team in the East with a chance to make it to the finals.
A team that I'm not quite sure what they're doing. It almost feels like when you pick up a carton of milk and you see that expiration date's approaching, is the Miami Heat. I feel like they're running it back. They didn't do much to bolster that roster. You brought in Alec Burks, but I don't know how that's going to move the needle. When you're looking at this Miami Heat roster, are you thinking it's only a matter of time before they maybe have to start to make some moves to maybe break it up? Like Jimmy Butler, I believe, only has 1 year left on his deal. Or are you saying, is this maybe a team that's waiting in the shadows, waiting for a deal to happen? Like, for instance, when they wanted Dame, but they couldn't get that deal done. It feels like Miami has struck out on making those trades to upgrade this roster.
Never, ever underestimate Pat Riley and Andy Ellisberg. Never underestimate the Heat when it comes to their ambition, their desire, their creativity, and their willingness to do whatever it takes. All that said, once they missed on Dame a year ago, it feels to me like they're like the fate of this era was kind of sealed, right? Like maybe somebody else falls out of the woodwork. It hasn't happened yet. It's been a year since they lost out on Dame, almost a year, and they've only just lost more talent, right? Like they lost Caleb Martin and they replaced him with Alec Burks. That's a downgrade. A year ago they lost Max Strus and Gabe Vincent while they were waiting to try to pull off the Dame deal. They've lost multiple pieces from that team that made the finals in 2023, and Jimmy Butler's not getting any younger. And he you talk about another guy with injury issues. I mean, he misses 20, 30 games a season every year, and he's going to be 35 in September, with a lot of miles and a lot of hard miles on him, because that's to his credit, that's just the way Jimmy plays. He plays his butt off, but that takes a toll. Does Nikola Jovic make a leap? Does Jaime Jaquez make a leap? Could they find a Tyler Hero trade that upgrades them somehow? I don't know. I kind of feel like if I had to guess, I think this mini run, this mini era is over. And listen, they made 2 finals.
It was a good run. It really was.
Pretty damn good run. 2 finals that no one would have projected, and beat a lot of teams that were better on paper, that had better talent along the way to do it. But I think it was a little bit misleading to think that, okay, you could go from play-in team to finals and we could just keep doing it that way. Like that's not a realistic path. And I don't think I think some fans might have been deluded into thinking you could repeat that. I don't think the Heat ever were. But yeah, I mean, listen, like they were clearly hesitant to give Jimmy Butler a big extension at this stage, given his age and injury history. Jimmy Butler then ends up, I can't remember if it was an announcement or if it was a leaked thing where it was basically like, oh, Jimmy Butler no longer wants an extension. Come on, give me a break. Like everybody wants an extension, especially when you're in your mid 30s. So the idea that they were tabling it to me was more of a political move. It was clear that the Heat were very hesitant to invest too much further in him, given the circumstances. So now he's, an expiring contract. Now he's a potential walkaway free agent in 2025. And I got to think that puts him at the head of the line for potential trades. Like when we're having, these conversations 2 months from now, when we're moving from training camp into preseason or into opening night, and everyone's talking about, all right, who are the players to keep an eye on between now and the trade deadline? Jimmy Butler's got to be top of the list, doesn't he?
Yeah.
Especially if they're not winning.
Yeah.
Especially if they're not winning.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know we got to let you go here in a minute, but I did want to kind of shift things a little bit. I didn't send this to you ahead of time for like a part of our preview, but I
surprise questions.
Well, I just want to go back because you've been covering the league for a good amount of time now. So I'm just curious, maybe you could remember if there was ever a trade or something or a signing that didn't happen that you thought was going to happen. That was one of those big significant moves. You're like, man, this trade almost happened, but it didn't. That you can remember and maybe how that could have changed the landscape of the league.
One of those fun sliding doors moments.
Yes.
Man, this is one of those questions where when you have to, it's like, tell me a good joke and immediately your mind goes blank of jokes.
I apologize. I should have put this on the list. My bad.
No, it's all right. Excuse me. Trying to think of, I mean, like the legendary one, this is going way back, was when the summer that the Magic signed Grant Hill and Tracy McGrady.
Tim Duncan, right?
And it could have been Tim Duncan. Yeah, there was talk of them getting all three. Which, my God, the number of ways in which that changes NBA history. Wow. There was also in that same time frame, the Spurs had been chasing Jason Kidd, and there was talk of I think it was Kidd would have replaced Tony Parker. So there's a couple of interesting ones involving the Spurs. I was covering the Knicks, of course, when they were chasing, LeBron.
How close was that to happening?
I don't think that was ever close to happening, but I mean, it was, they put everything into that. Then they put everything into trying to get, Kevin Durant, 5 years ago, and maybe they dodged a bullet by not getting him, given the way things worked out for the Nets. But so I think of ones where there were huge pursuits. In the case of LeBron, there were a lot of indications at the time, including some things that LeBron said that I think led people to believe that he was either seriously considering or maybe even leaning toward New York, and before he ended up not, right? Mm-hmm. The Durant one, the Knicks absolutely, at the time that they started clearing out that cap room, thought they were getting him. There's no question in my mind there. But those are not exactly the kind of sliding door moments you're talking about, where it's like something was close and maybe fell through, or
what is that?
Let me ask you this. I don't know if you remember or not. How close was KD to staying in OKC before going to Golden State?
I think he was dead. I don't want to say dead set. I think he absolutely wanted to leave and just needed the right opportunity and the right circumstances. I think the question there becomes if we hadn't had the cap spike that created this once in a blue moon opportunity for the Warriors, who already had 3 All-Stars, 3 All-NBA players, all making, max or max-ish money. I guess Steph was still on the sub-max contract, I guess. So there was the other part of it, right? Because of the ankle issues early on. But so the cap spike enables the Warriors to chase Kevin Durant under circumstances that ordinarily in the NBA, a team with that kind of talent and contracts wouldn't have been able to do. If the Warriors had not had that, if the cap spike never happens, would Durant have still left Oklahoma to go to, say, Boston? Who were also in the mix that summer. My guess is yes. Like my guess is based on my reporting at the time and how much I knew about Durant's just concerns with his partnership with Westbrook and everything. I think he was leaving regardless, as long as there was an opportunity to do something great elsewhere. The Warriors obviously, were by far the best opportunity, but there's that, there's probably a zillion others. I'm sorry, like off the top of my head, I can't think of any others where it fit the description of like I thought might happen and didn't. But
everybody says for the Magic and that it came down to, Doc Rivers didn't want family flying on the plane, and apparently that was a big deal breaker. That's like the urban legend for Duncan, why he backed out. I just feel like you look at where the Orlando Magic have been for the last 25 years or so. I know they had the run to the finals in 2009, but it's like that franchise would have been completely different, you would imagine, if Duncan goes. Then you look at the Spurs. The Spurs aren't the Spurs. Pop's, I would imagine, not still there. There are a few rings less. Like, to me, that feels like the biggest shift on a lot of different things, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, if we're doing biggest what ifs in NBA history, and based on situations that at least seemed not just plausible, but maybe even likely, or it was at least really tempting, right? If you consider those kinds of situations, that's one of the biggest in NBA history, right? Because the Spurs are one of a handful of dynasties in the history of the league. And yeah, what we think of Duncan and Ginobili and Parker, of Kawhi for that matter, in joining that group, of Pop, everybody's reputations, all of NBA history is different. But then again, there's a what if involving Duncan that precedes that, which is what if the Celtics had won the lottery the Duncan year, which they thought they were, or were hoping they were. And there's a bunch of those in NBA history too. So, but even still, like, yes, the Magic have wandered in the wilderness for most of the last 20 something years, despite one of the great offseason coups, like getting Grant Hill and Tracy McGrady. I cannot emphasize enough for your younger listeners how big a deal that was. Like that was a massive freaking coup to get McGrady and Grant Hill. And then Grant Hill could never, get healthy, right? He had all these awful ankle issues. That dude was a freaking stud. Like,
Must be the next Jordan at one point. That's what they were saying.
He was in the long list of next Jordans. But Grant Hill was legit. And McGrady, people know. And if those two had stayed healthy, even without Duncan, that team could have been special. And then I think about what those two could have done. Like you think about like the great wing combinations now, and it's just such a wing run league now. Back then it was still, largely a big man era, but like prime McGrady and Grant Hill in today's NBA would have been amazing. Would have been absolutely a killer. Like that's I don't want to make the comparison, but they would have been awesome.
Yeah, I mean, McGrady was already putting up 30 plus. So I mean, you tack on at least an extra 5 points in this era, and all of a sudden he's doing something pretty special. But
yeah,
Howard, I definitely want to thank you for coming back on. We really appreciate you, making your yearly appearance on Setting the Pace. I know we kept you over only because we were having fun, but please tell everybody where they could find you on social media and some of the awesome content that you're putting out.
Yeah, stories are always at theringer.com, of course. Social media, you can find me at Howard Beck on Twitter, at Howard A. Beck on Instagram, but I'm hardly ever posting on Instagram, so just find me on Twitter if you need to yell at me.
We won't yell, but we appreciate you, Howard. Thanks a lot. Everybody make sure you're checking out those articles. It's always great stuff. And Howard, until next time, we appreciate you.
Appreciate it, fellas. Thanks for having me.